Great. So good afternoon and welcome to the fifth session of the Sunoikisis Digital Classics Spring 2019 syllabus. This session will be introduced by Marja Vierros and Polina Yordanova, both from the University of Helsinki, and will be an introduction to tree banking, the first of two sessions on tree banking. In 2 weeks' time, we'll have a session on using and working with the tree banks and the inverse dependencies. So this session will be more hands-on on how to actually get started creating tree banks and tree banking annotations. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Marja, who you all know as the co-convener of this semester, who will kick us off and tell us a bit about this session. You're still muted, Marja.
Okay, sorry, I was muted. So maybe now you can hear me. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. And welcome also from me. And so we are presenting introduction to tree banking, and I will start screen sharing now. Okay. Do you see my screen now and my slides?
Yes.
Great. So the structure of the session today is that I will first give a gentle introduction to dependency grammar and tree banking as a concept, and also taking some examples from Latin and Greek annotations and what sort of issues we might have there. Also discussing a little bit about the literary versus documentary text annotation. And then the second half is devoted to tree banking in action. So Polly will demonstrate the annotation tool Arethusa. And like Gabby just mentioned, in 2 weeks' time, we have a second session that's related to tree banks, basically using tree banked corpora, and the universal dependencies are discussed there. And it's led by Marco Passarotti and Timo Korkeakangas. So this is first part, and that one is second part. So I will start with just mentioning an obvious fact that the tree structure, the tree diagram, is just a graphical way of representing some hierarchical structure. So it can be any hierarchical structure, and we can present it in different ways, multiple different ways, as a tree. So that's why we are talking about tree banking. That's the main theme. I just took one example here for a language family tree. So for your education, some information about the Finnic language family is visible there. But today we will, of course, be talking about Greek and Latin and trees consisting of sentences. So here we have just one sentence from Caesar. So in that river there was a bridge, and that can be hierarchically represented like this tree, and we will see how it comes about. So what is a tree bank? So it's a parsed text corpus that annotates syntactic or semantic sentence structure. And tree banking is the activity of building these linguistic trees. So basically linguistic annotation. So we are adding new information. We are adding linguistic information to a text corpus. And there are many different types of linguistic information we can add to the text. We can add things at word level. We were already discussing lemmas and that sort of things in the second session this spring, when we were using the online tools, corpus tools. So we were able to search lemmas even though we didn't have tree banks. But these can be included in the trees, the same information. And morphological annotation is usually there. Can be different types of morphologies annotated so inflectional morphology or derivational morphology. And usually the part of speech annotation is a separate thing, so word classes, parts of speech. Then very often with tree banks we are actually meaning syntactic annotation, and there we have different grammar formalisms behind as a theoretical background. Most importantly here, two types, dependency or constituent structures, are used in tree banks. And then we can also add semantic annotation, the meaning of words, but this is not the topic today. So there is just one reference to basic corpus linguistics and linguistically annotated corpora textbook that you can learn more from.
Marja, could you just click hide on that little Google Hangouts warning bar at the bottom there? That's obscuring a little bit.
Are you seeing that too? Sorry.
Cool, thank you.
Right. Okay, so what's the difference between dependency and constituency structure? The dependency grammar presumes direct links between linguistic units, so words, and the finite verb is taken to be the center of the clause structure, so that's the root, and all other syntactic units, other words, depend either directly or indirectly from the root. So each word has a head on which it depends, except the main verb, which depends, it doesn't depend on anything. Actually, it's the root. So here, the example tree, we have the predicate here as the root, the verb, and then this tree, there's the determiner, which is depending on the noun, the tree, and so on. And in constituency grammar, which is also called phrase structure grammar, there is the idea that words are grouped into phrases, noun phrases, or verbal phrases, or adverbial phrases, etc. And these phrases are then similarly hierarchically grouped into larger phrases and finally clauses. So there's an example tree from this. So we have here the sentence, which is divided into noun phrase and verbal phrase. And the noun phrase is formed by this tree. And the verbal phrase is a bigger entity here, which is then divided to another verbal phrase and another noun phrase. So for tree banks, there are, of course, several types, several languages, and we have tree banks for modern languages, we have tree banks for historical languages. One big and basic tree bank is the Penn tree bank. For English, there are historical text and modern text, and for example, big corpora of newspaper text. And for Latin, this is one of the oldest things, historically very important in our field, the Index Thomisticus, so the works of Thomas Aquinas. And the Proyel tree bank corpus has been also mentioned in the Sunoikisis classes several times. So it's the parallel corpus of old Indo-European languages. The starting point was the New Testament in different translations. So these were all annotated, but now they have also added other texts. So there are several different languages, also Greek and Latin. And the Proyel tree bank corpus can be browsed via one interface, and there's another interface for querying it, which has also been shown in Sunoikisis. You can also see all different types of tree banks for ancient Greek that exist. Well, this blog post is a little bit old, but I don't think there are much new ones. And then the universal dependencies for I don't remember how many languages there are now, over 40 anyway. But you will hear more about that in 2 weeks' time. So let's talk about now ancient Greek and Latin dependency tree bank. That's our main topic today. So this is a project that has started this is a screenshot from their webpage. So the Tufts University, this project began there in 2006, and nowadays it's basically developed more in Leipzig by Giuseppe Celano, and Gregory Crane still acting there. So there is already quite many texts that have been annotated. For Greek, there's 15 authors, both poetry and prose, Homer and the tragedies and all sorts of things. And for Latin, we have a little bit less, but also poetry and prose. Unfortunately, I cannot say how many words these consist of now. But you can visit the site and also download the files. So how are we performing the linguistic annotation in the Perseid's project's platform called Arethusa? There is the automatic tokenization. Then there is lemmatization and morphological parsing, which is done semi-automatically. The syntactic relations we have to do manually at the moment. There is also an optional semantic layer, but only for Greek, and that's also done manually. There are guidelines for how to perform the annotation, and it's really important to try to follow the guidelines so that people who are then querying the corpora can rely on the fact that they can find the structures according to the guidelines. And also there are now people developing also automatic morphological parsers and automatic syntactic parsers. So for that also it's important that we try to be consistent and so that the annotations are comparable. Now there is one sentence from Xenophon. Socrates is guilty of rejecting the gods acknowledged by the state and bringing in new strange deities, which is now presented here as with a syntactic tree. There's the predicate as the root, and there's Socrates as the subject, and then there is two coordinated participle phrases, which are defining the state of the verb. So how Socrates is doing something wrong by rejecting the gods and bringing in new deities. But this surface structure of the syntactic tree also we have more information about this sentence than what this tree tells us here. So there's the underlying XML, which is formed when we tree bank. You don't have to write this code yourself, but the Arethusa platform will do this XML file for the sentence for you while you annotate. So here we see that the sentence will get its own ID number. Every word is getting its own ID number. And here we have the forms that are in the sentence. Here we have the lemmas, and then the morphological annotation is in this post-tag string that I will show later. And then the syntactic relation is informed here, and the dependencies are told here in as stating what is the head for each verb. So because this predicate here is the root, its head is 0, but Socrates is the subject, and it was directly depending on the predicate. So the word ID 1 is its head. So that's how this thing works. So for the post tag, this is the easy machine readable string for the whole morphological annotation. So each part represents one of these items, and we have a set of letters or numbers that then tell what these elements are. So for example, the adike, this post tag tells us that there's the part of speech is verb, and the person is third person, and the number is singular, the tense is present, and the mood is indicative, and the voice is active, and the 7, 8, and 9 places are left blank because this doesn't apply to the verb. And in contrast, for polis, it's the noun, and for it we don't have the person, but we have the number, it's singular. And since it's not a verb, we don't have a tense, mood, or voice for it, but we have gender and case here. So here is the key for these letters and numbers, what they actually mean. This is something you need to know when you do queries. And you need to then know that N in position 1 means noun, but then again N in position 5 means infinitive. So also there are same letters appearing more than once, but they are in different places. So this is why you need to then define which place you are searching for an N post tag. And for the guidelines, so for Greek, we have 2 versions. We have newer one, the 2.0, written by Giuseppe Celano, and we have links for those in the syllabus. And there is morphological, syntactic, and semantic layer described. The older version, 1.1, basically is the same, but there are a couple of things that are no longer followed in 2.1. So we should be following 2.1 to guidelines, but I have the link for the older guidelines here as well, because it has some more examples, some more explanations for some things which still are valid. So you can also check that. And also, if you are performing queries on tree banks that have been tree banked using these older guidelines, of course, then you need to know what the labels that are used there are standing for. For Latin, we have only one set of guidelines, version 1.3, already done by 2007. So sometimes when you are annotating, you find that the thing that you are wondering about how to annotate is not in the guidelines presented in the examples there. So what to do then? You can then try to look the existing tree banks and compare to the already existing annotations there. But then you really I advise that you are cautious, because you are not necessarily sure which version has been used. And then, well, it should be stated there, but it's not always so clear. And then different annotators might have had different types of views on some issues. So you have to be critical when comparing to the existing annotations. So also, when you start Treebanking and you are not very familiar with the dependency grammar, there are some things that you might be wondering about, and these two things are the most common things that people have questions with. So the OBJ, the object, is a bit wider thing in the dependency tree bank guidelines. So it's used for the direct object, which is usually pretty clear, but it's also used for the indirect object and also for verbal complements, the required arguments. And the other thing is the ADV, adverbial. It specifies the circumstances under which a verb or an adjective or adverb takes place. An adverb can be an adverb. It can also be a prepositional phrase, a noun, a participle, or a subordinate clause. So these are the things that people are most often confused with, but you get used to it quite soon. Here is one example from a bilingual school text. So there's a parallel old school text about Trojan Wars. There's one sentence here, both in Latin and Greek. So Patroclus, son of Menoetius, came to Achilles crying about the injustice of the Greeks and asked him the weapons, and he got the weapons with an well, I don't know, army. how you would translate the exercitus. So I have here now both the Latin and Greek tree banked. So you can look at the version that you are on the language which is more familiar to you. First thing I mention is that we have here three predicates that are on the same level. They are coordinated. So there's the et or kai, which is coordinating these three verbs, and there is actually one other coordinator, which is then also depending on the same et. So three verbs, and Patroclus is the subject for all of them, and that's why Patroclus is put here on the tree depending on the coordinator. But about these OBJ elements, we have here three clearly direct objects. So crying about the injustice and asking about the weapons and getting the weapons. So here we also got this element of elliptic things that have not been said, but then we need them in the tree. So that the arma has not been repeated in the last part of the sentence where when Patroclus also gets the weapons. But then the object OBJ is also used for the required arguments. So when Patroclus is coming to Achilles and is asking the weapons from him. Then the ADV is also in this sentence. So it's marked here as a adverbial for the verb to come. So he was crying when he was coming to Achilles. This is the idea in this annotation, but it's possible to interpret this in a different way as well, which is in this next slide. So the participles very often can be adverbials, specifying the verb, but they can also be attributes. specifying some nouns or something else. So here is another possibility to annotate this sentence. So Patroclus, son of Menoetius, is coming crying. The participle is defining Patroclus directly there. Both annotations are in fact okay. It depends on your interpretation. So the guidelines do not always tell you, they don't give you one exact answer. But here I think the participle cry, the Patroclus crying, is a bit different type of attribute than, for example, that he is son of Menoetius. This is a attribute that's always valid for Patroclus. He's always the son of Menoetius, whatever he does. But when he's crying, he's actually, it seems to me that the adverbial would be better annotation. He's only crying when he's coming to Achilles. He's not perhaps crying anymore when he is receiving the weapons. But there's always some room for interpretation. So a few words about differences between literature and documentary texts. Because with literature we have manuscript tradition, and so we are usually only annotating one edition of a text. So one perhaps taken from the Perseus Digital Library. So what about the different possible readings? We don't have the apparatus criticus there in Perseus Digital Library or other corpora. But if we have a paper edition in our hands with the apparatus, we can also change some words during the annotation if that seems relevant. But usually with literature, people are annotating that certain edition, and that's how it is. With documentary texts, they are direct sources from antiquity, and they are often fragmentary, so we have different types of problems with them. And the papyri and Ostroga texts, there's loads of them in papyri.info, marked in TEI epidoc XML. And also many inscriptions are available in TEI epidoc XML, also but a bit more scattered places. So if we want to use those texts, we would need to pre-process them so that we would have a text which is suitable for tree banking. And then we have to think about the Leiden markup. It sometimes contains very important information for supplements and regularized forms for words. And linguistically, the original forms would be the interesting ones. So this is something that I have been working with. I wanted to annotate papyri with so that we actually can use the papyri.info text, but the TEI epidoc XML data there is not easily transformed to Arethusa. So there are those tags within the text, if you remember from the first session of this spring. So we developed this Seematia tool here in Helsinki for getting rid of the tags, but still preserving the information. I'm not presenting Seematia in any more detail now because we are actually making a new version for it. But the basic idea will be the same anyway. There we create two parallel layers for each text, the original one and the regularized one. So I have here one example of a sentence from one letter from the Xenon archive. So there's two first lines of a text of a papyrus. There's to Xenon, greetings from Senkhons. I made a petition to you about my donkey, which Nikias took. So you can see that the ends of the lines are broken. There are supplements from the editor, but the original papyrus does not have the ends of the lines. So I have two trees from this sentence, this second sentence, and this regularized version here looks nice and whole, but then the original version, we can build the syntactic tree because we can be fairly sure that this is how this sentence has looked like, that this has been the predicate anyway, and this has been the subject there. But we will not annotate these words so that we would see the exact form, so we can have the lemma and the part of speech that is the verb, but we don't annotate the person, for example, or the tempus or anything like that, because this hasn't been wholly preserved, this word. Same with Nikias. We are not totally sure what the original writer actually wrote, because this is what we then want to study, the original forms, when we study the language. Okay, that was shortly also then some papyrus annotation there. And now let's go into business. Polina will show us the demo on how to use Arethusa and how to annotate.
Thank you, Marja, for the wonderful introduction to Treebanking. Now, my job here is to show you how Treebanking is actually done through this really powerful and versatile and easily customizable platform that Arethusa is. So I am going to share my screen now. Hopefully sharing already. Yes, so in the class outline, we've provided you with the link that you can follow in order to get to Arethusa. And when you get there, this is what you'll see. You are required to sign in and create a profile if you don't have one already, so that your work can be saved and you can have a profile where you store all your annotations. Something that Arethusa does is it doesn't ask you to create a profile specifically for this platform, but it uses your profiles from other providers. So you can pick whichever suits you best, and it will provide limited access to the platform so that it can recognize you. So I won't do this here now because I'm already logged in my profile. So when you create it, this is more or less what you're going to see, but this part of the screen here will be empty when you first create your profile. As you see here, you will later on have a list of all the annotations that you've done, which are divided in different sections depending on their progress. So in order to make a new annotation, we are provided with a big handy green button that we can click on. And here is where you have several options for introducing text into Arethusa. In case you know that your text is part of Perseus catalog, you can access it through this inconspicuous link over here, and you can pick whichever text you're interested in. Well, maybe not here. Whichever text you're interested in, and whichever section, and somewhere at the end of it, you will have a little link saying create a tree bank. So this will take you to the annotating environment. But in case your text is not in fact part of Perseus database, you can copy and paste it directly into the input window, and this is what we're going to do now. So as Marja showed you in her presentation, the act of tree banking is basically producing an XML code which records all sorts of information, linguistic information for the sentences and the individual words in it. But since this code is hardly human readable, and it would be a nightmare to have to write it down ourselves, Arethusa's function is to hide this code from us, and so that we can work in a nicer environment. So when I click on edit here and I create the actual notation, you will see for a very brief moment the XML being created, and you will never need to see it again, fortunately. So once you've entered your text, you can specify the language, and you can either directly start and edit your sentences, or this is one very important link to remember, because under it are hidden all the different tag sets. So a tag set refers to a system of labels and an approach towards annotating the language that have been used by different projects for different purposes. So if you're using Latin, the first option that is automatically selected is pretty much your best choice. Of course, there is also the possibility to use the tag set without the morphology provided for you. You'll see in a minute what that means. For Greek, the first option is also good, but in case you want to have the semantic layer, which Marja mentioned about, you need to go with the Smythe grammar tag set. Since I know that some of the people who are watching this are not really comfortable with the languages, I'm also going to briefly highlight this tag set over here, the Universal Dependencies English tag set, which you can use if you want to try tree banking, but don't want to deal with Latin notation Greek. So since everything seems to be fine, I will click on the edit button and see how XML gets generated here, and then thankfully it disappears. So my Arethusa is running in Bulgarian, but this is because the creators have generously provided various different languages that you can pick from. This is where you change them from. So let me quickly guide you through what you see when you first enter your annotation. This is where you have the text. You see how with the mouse you can highlight each word. This is where you will build the tree, and remember that these two fields are interconnected. So when you click here, it results in things happening here and vice versa. Here we have the different tabs representing the different levels of annotation. We have the morph tab responsible for the morphological annotation, the relation tab, which assigns syntactical labels to the words. This tab here allows us to introduce artificial tokens whenever we need to build a tree which has an ellipsis in it. And I'll show you what these three do in a bit. And here we have a possibility to save what we're doing, to download the XML of our work. And something very important is the help button. This is one of the tools where you might really benefit from reading the help for, because it gives you all sorts of information that you would otherwise struggle with in the beginning. So the color legends of morphological annotations, the keyboard shortcuts, which I can speak from experience, can save you a lot of time and efforts. And also what the different messages mean, so that you don't get frustrated when you get work. So something that I would recommend you to do as soon as you have created your annotation is to actually exit to your work field and change its title, because currently the title of your annotation is this long incomprehensible string. And once you have more than one annotation, it might become difficult for you to navigate through all things you have worked on. And as a general principle, the annotations that you've most recently worked with are placed here on top of the list, so it might be really difficult for you to find what you're searching for. So this is where you change the title from, and you can give it whatever title suits you best. So we see the list of all the sentences here. We can also download a copy of our text from this place. If we've decided that this was in fact a bad idea, we can delete our entire annotation from the overview, but that's not what we're going to do right now. So to get to actual tree banking, I will briefly guide you through how the different layers of annotation are created, but bear in mind that I will be mostly concentrating on the technical part, because it would be impossible for me to teach you how to tree bank in the half an hour that we have. So please make sure that you have read and preferably understood the guidelines before you start tree banking, so that you don't struggle in the beginning. So usually you can start by doing the morphological annotation of the sentence. You do this by clicking with the left button of the mouse on the word that you want to annotate, and provided you are in the Morph tab, you are given with a number of possible annotations. Those are provided by another tool that has been designed by the Proceeds project, so-called Morpheus, which really lists every possible annotation of that word form. And here it comes to the knowledge of the annotator to pick the one that is most suitable for this context. And in order to do that, you tick in the box. So notice how I've selected this already, but this word is still highlighted in yellow. Something that must be paid attention to is that this selection will not disappear until we have set a dependency between this word and another word. In case we don't want to do this right now, but we rather want to continue annotating morphology with the following word, what we need to do is we need to remove the selection, and this is done via pressing the escape button on your keyboard. And it's basically a good idea to keep your index finger glued to the escape button at first when you're annotating, because you would need to press it a lot. So next, we can continue clicking and choosing. Sometimes you only have one choice, but mind that you shouldn't always trust blindly what Morpheus says, because there are often cases when the suggestions provided are not particularly useful for us. So we can now press escape or click again on the word in order to deselect it. But Arethusa comes with shortcuts that really save a lot of time when tree banking. And one of the most useful ones are W, which moves the selection to the following word, or E, which moves backwards. So these two will be very handy when you start tree banking. So now when you've finished the morphological annotation of the sentence, you should make sure to click the Save button, because this is a rather short sentence and we haven't done that much. But if you spend much time, and especially if you have been idle for 5 minutes, Arethusa can actually kick you out of your profile. And then this might result in a lot of frustration. Now, a pro tip, user tip, is if that happens to you at any point, you are trying to save your annotation and it says that you have logged out, don't go back and don't change anything. Just open another browser tab and enter the Proceeds URL there, and then sign in, and then you will be able to finish what you were doing. So morphology is pretty much done now, and we can continue with building the tree. As Marja said, the finite verb is taken to be the root of the sentence, so we can take it by clicking on it, and then put it under the root by clicking on root. This sets a dependency, and we already see how the number of unused tokens has changed. So the main verb of the sentence governs all three of the words in this sentence. So we can safely put them under it, like so. As I mentioned, these two fields are basically the same. So I can also click here and here, and this would do the exact same thing. In case you've made a mistake, you always have the undo and redo. And these also have shortcuts created for them. So the apostrophe is redo and colon is undo. So in case you know that more than one word depends on another governor, you can make multiple word selection. And unfortunately, this only works for Windows. I'm told it's not available for Mac users, or rather we haven't figured it out yet. But on Windows, you would do that by holding the control on your keyboard and clicking on ever many words you want to append under the main head. And since this is one charming little tree, we're done using it, creating it, and we can start assigning labels. So the labels live in this tab, but can also be accessed by right-clicking on the word. So this, and if you click on the word, this are the same things. So again, it depends on how you feel more comfortable using Arethusa. And as I mentioned, it really is very customizable. So we know that our sentence has one predicate, and we can label it as so. And I will be switching between different annotation styles so that you can see various options that you might have. For natura, it's pretty obvious that this is the subject. Nihil would be the object. And notice how when I press a key on my keyboard, it gets shown here in the bottom left corner. So you can follow what I'm doing. And then frustra is pretty obviously the adverb here. So you see how when I assign the morphology of these words, they change color. This is the color code that I mentioned in the beginning. It's pretty useful when you have longer sentences to have the different words color-coded depending on which category of part of speech they belong to. Because at first glance, you can see what is in front of you. So again, saving to be on the safe side, and moving to the next sentence. So for some, and going back to morphology, for some words, Morpheus does give you options, but for others, it doesn't. And this might be due to several reasons. In the case of words like België, which are proper nouns, Morpheus doesn't really give you any useful suggestions. But if you don't get any suggestion for a word, there is a big chance that you have mistyped it, as I have done here on purpose, so that I show you what to do in such cases. So if you see that something is wrong with a word which you have already added into your annotation, there is a way to change this, but unfortunately you have to go and see the dreadful XML code. So you access the XML by exiting back to the proceeds and clicking on the Edit XML button. So this is what Arethusa has been hiding from us this whole time. You can see how sentences that I haven't worked on yet have all the values of their attributes empty, but the sentence which I have tree banked already has all the necessary information recorded. So this is where we have the typo, and we can simply click and add the missing letter and save. And as long as you get a green message, that means everything is in order and you can go back to editing the actual sentence. So now when we click on include, Morpheus recognizes this as a word form of inculo, and you can mark it as such. So I won't be going more into morphology because this is arguably the easiest part of the tree banking. Let's concentrate a little bit more on creating the actual tree, which might prove to be more challenging. So if we pretend that the sentence ends here, it's pretty simple to tree bank this part. Include is the finite verb, België is its subject, and this would be the object. But the second part of this sentence actually has an ellipsis here. This sentence means the België inhabit one part and the Aquitani the other. But the verb inhabit is implied here. We as humans can easily understand that, but in order to build a tree that can be queried usefully afterwards, we need to supply the tree with the missing thing. In order to do that, We go to the third tab in Arethusa, the AT, which stands for artificial token, and we can create something to append these words to. So there are two options at this point. You can either leave these blank if you don't want to specify exactly what the word that is missing is. When you're fairly certain what it is, you can actually add it. That doesn't really matter because artificial tokens can be escaped when performing queries since they don't really exist in the text per se. So you can now attach this. If you click on a word where you want to position it next to, it will tell you whether it will put it in front of it, or in case, like now I do, you want to put it behind it, you can change the direction from here. And when you add the token, you can also make its morphology explicit. So now we can also say that aliam and aquitani depend on inculunt, but as Marja told you, the root of the verb of the sentence, must be a verb, and now we have two verbs that are coordinated. In the example that she showed, we had conjunctions coordinating the different parts of the sentence. Here we don't, so we need to take something to be the coordinator. This will be the comma in our case. So we change the label of the comma to chord, and remember, pressing Control, we take both predicates and attach it under the coordinator. And now, since these are not just preds anymore, they're not just predicates, but coordinated predicates, we should label them as such. Now, I'll show you another advanced feature of Arethusa. In the Relation tab, you can click to have advanced mode, and whenever you know that more than one token will have the same label, you can, again, select them with Control, assign the same label to all of them in one go, again, saving time. And here we also know that these are not calls, but objects, and that these are the subjects. So another quite handy feature that Arethusa gives you is the morphological pre-selection. So you can tell the tool to automatically assign morphological annotations to all words in the sentence, but you should be really careful when you do that, because more often than not, you will end up with selections that aren't really true, aren't correct, as now. So never trust a computer too much. This is why we as annotators must be always taking the final decision. But what is useful also here is that if you click on the Expand Selected tick, you also get a full description of what this form's annotation is. But for the more common forms, you also have linked to dictionary entries where you can see a full description of that lemma, and so you can check every selection that you make. So fixing this would take quite a lot of time, and this is why I have the correct morphology made here. And now we can build the tree together. This is a much longer sentence than the ones I was showing, and it also has interesting subordinate clauses. But since it does require some time to assign labels to words, I have already given those labels, as you can see. And so I will be just building the tree, and this is why the words will be appearing already labeled. So this sentence reads, "It becomes all men who desire to excel the other animals, to strive to the utmost of their power, not to pass their lives in obscurity and silence, like the beasts of the field," in the translation that I'm using by John Selby Watson, "which nature has formed, groveling and subservient to appetite." So the main verb of this sentence would be decet, and we can take it and put it under the root. You see all these commas appended here? there really isn't much difference where you put the commas, as long as they're not coordinating commas like the ones we had in the previous sentence. But it's not a bad idea to keep them close to the words which are the heads of the subordinate clause that has been, for example, delimited by the commas, and not have them hang under the root, because the tree looks tidier like this, but we'll get rid of them later. So it becomes all men to strive. So we can put niti under decet, and this will be its subject. And it's all men who should strive. So homines goes under niti. And omnis, being an adjective to homines, goes under it. So at this point, we can continue with the central branch of the tree, or we can pay attention to this little attributive clause that has been delimited by these commas. All men who desire, and now see that the branch, the main verb, the main word that is carrying the branch for the attributive clause is the verb, since the verb has the most significance in dependency grammar. So the finite verb. So we put student as the bearer of the attributive label, and we can put qui as its subject and prestare as its object. Then sese and animalibus can come under prestare, and ceteris, of course, goes under animalibus. Then we can go back to this little adverbial phrase. They must strive to the utmost of their power. So since ope is describing how they should be striving, it's labeled as an ADV. But we're not saying that ope is an adverbial itself. And then we can focus on this little subordinate clause that is introduced by the conjunction ne. So by convention, conjunctions and especially subordinate conjunctions should be introducing the clause like this and bearing this label. The labels are thoroughly explained in the guidelines, so you can go in and check them out there. And then, of course, the most important word in our subordinate clause is the verb, which comes here. So they must strive not to pass through life in silence. And now this is an interesting construction here. You see, I've already added the artificial token, but this wasn't here to begin with, if you remember. This is because I wouldn't be able to build the tree, I wouldn't be able to build this comparison unless I had the verb there. So this is why it was added. So we use veluti as the branch connecting transient, and at this point we add the subject of this non-existent verb. So this is here just in order to provide something to link these two parts together. And then we have a little attributive clause for this word. And again, we start by attaching the verb, its subject, its object, and here we have two attributes that are connected by this conjunction. So we attach the conjunction under the verb, and we take both the attributes and attach it under the conjunction. And remember, whenever something is coordinated, it bears the co label, and ventri goes under obedientia. And this is pretty much how the tree should look like, minus all these commas that can go under the head of the clause which they delimit. But this is just tidying up. What I wanted to show you is functionality that is relatively new. When you have bigger sentences, such as this one, for example, and you want to be able to see not only morphology being presented, but also you want to be able to query inside Arethusa, because this is also possible. You will learn more about querying tree banks in 2 weeks, but there's this really handy functionality already inbuilt in Arethusa that allows you to perform simple queries. And sometimes it's useful to perform these queries not sentence for sentence, but to be able to display more than one sentence together. And you can change this from the global settings, where you can say the chunk mode. You can specify how many sentences you want to be displayed. So it's usually one, and this is why we see only one sentence when we open this annotation. But you can make up to 10 sentences be displayed together. Let's have to for the sake of our presentation. And what this does is you see both sentences shown here in the text window, and here you can see how you can switch between the two trees. So why this is useful is because when you perform your queries over here, you will get results from both sentences, not just the sentence that's being displayed. For example, if I care about things that are labeled as attributive for one reason or another, I can specify that here, and I get a list of all the things that bear the ATR label. And in this sentence, I see that such things are adjectives, pronouns. In the following sentence, I have a participle that is attributive, and also a verb, which governs subordinate attributive clause. And in case any of these is not relevant for your query, you can remove it from the results and the selection that is happening here by just clicking on it, see how it disappears. You can also search by token if you're pretty certain what you're searching for, or by form. For example, you want to search for a verb, and you get all the verbs, or you want to search for an adverb, and here all of them highlighted. So this is something that's extremely useful once you've tree-banked your entire text and you want to do interesting things with it. Something else that can be changed by Arethusa's very customizable interface is currently the color code is representing the words according to the category of a part of speech that they are assigned. You can change that so that the relation becomes the criterion on which the words are colorized. Sometimes this is more handy if you're interested in this, or if you get confused by all these different colors, you can also disable that and you will see plain text. And something else that is useful in big trees like that, sometimes it helps if we can change the perspective. I don't remember if I mentioned that you can zoom in the tree and out on the tree with your mouse wheel. And if you're not using a mouse, but just your mouse pad, double click would also do. Here, if you want to center the tree, you can use this icon or press the S shortcut. D makes the perfect width of the sentence, which would be nope, this one, so that you can see all the words participating in the tree. Something that is really useful to change the perspective is to change the direction of the tree. Sometimes, especially in trees where you have coordination on multiple levels, seeing the tree presented like this might really change the way you look at it. And as always, you can save and download when you're done doing your annotation. But something that we've recently discovered in Arethusa and is pretty handy is that you can, if you want to access another annotation, you don't really need to exit and then go home and search for what your next annotation would be like, as long as you know its unique code. So notice how each annotation has different code here. This is the unique identifier within the system of Perseids. As long as you know this for your annotation, you can very easily access it from here, sorry for Bulgarian, by just providing this unique 5 digits ID, and it will take you to the other annotation. In my case, they look the same, but trust me, those are two different annotations. And yes, this is pretty much what I wanted to show you in Arethusa. I see that I'm also a little bit over time, so thank you very much for your attention. How do I stop screen sharing? Like this? Yes.
Thank you, Polly. That's perfect. I think that's really useful and cool. Does anyone? I have a couple of questions for both Mario and Polly. But does anyone else have anything they want to ask or say before we do that? No, in which case I'll jump in with my questions then. So I have two questions. One is that let's say one of the students following this this session does the exercise as they all will, of course, and practices with a few lines of Greek or Latin or whatever, and gets quite into the idea of tree banking, wants to do more. They can, of course, just go out and grab their favorite text and upload it, or use a text from Perseus or whatever, and tree bank thousands of lines of that text, because just out of enthusiasm. But how can they be useful in so doing? Because we talk about these, this relatively small amount of text that Perseus has tree banked and the various other places have tree banked. How could they contribute to an existing project somehow? Do you have any suggestions for that?
So as long as they have strictly followed the guidelines provided by the Perseids project, as far as things stand right now at the moment, the Perseids is quite open to accepting annotations done by volunteers, so they can contact the people responsible for the project, and they can provide their annotation for review, and then it could end up being added to the database and be useful for everyone else. And it's also something I forgot mentioning while I was presenting, is that you are in fact responsible for your annotation, in the sense that your name stands in every annotation that you've done. So this is something that you are contributing with to the academic society, and it's also a publication that you're making, which in some institutes is counted as such, as a publication. So I do advise and urge people who have taken interest in tree banking to try it out themselves, and if they see that it's something that they like and would like to contribute to go ahead.
Right, yeah, that's the point of that. The micro publications is very important. If you've done maybe two sentences, that's not going to convince anybody one thing or another on your CV. But if you've marked up several hundred sentences that way, and they've been approved and vetted and contributed to the tree bank, that is something which is significant, both in terms of contribution and in terms of credit. Yeah.
Crucially, the guidelines need to be followed thoroughly in order for people who then want to do something with these trees with the database can rely that when they query for something and they expect to get something in return, this will be consistently annotated throughout all the annotation. So this is why we need to follow one code of action in all our annotations.
Right. I know that a lot of projects they will use a system of double entry when tree banking, getting volunteers to tree bank in this way, and so then they have a third person vetting any differences between those, or even checking the whole thing. Is there anybody who's doing this sort of thing at the moment who might be willing to receive a note from existing volunteers that you know of, from new volunteers, I mean?
I don't personally know about anybody doing that right now, but I mean, it all comes to contacting the people who are responsible for the project now. Yeah.
The other possibility, of course, I think Marja's about to say.
Yeah, I was going to say that depends on what types of text you want to work with. So if you're doing pieces of literature, then you should be contacting ancient Greek dependency tree bank people in Leipzig and Tufts. But then if you want to annotate, say, papyri, then you can contact me. And well, the Semantia platform is open, and the other text taken to Arethusa from there is directly the Semantia board where we will then check the annotations. So that's one way contributing, and they are papyri are of course shortened text, and we are happy to have just even 1 or 2 papyri annotated. So please do.
Anita has also asked a question in the comments here saying, have you tried the JMH tag set with Latin or Greek text, and if so, with what results?
I haven't personally tried it. I know it's quite different than the one that is provided by the Perseus project, and it also serves different results, different purposes, and because it gives different results. So I unfortunately can't tell you much more about it, but I know that some people find it really useful for their purposes.
Could you tell us what JMH is?
What it stands for? Well, this is one of the tags.
What the main differences are? Okay, so it's another tag set.
It's another tag set, yes. It uses different labels for the syntactic relationships.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Yes, thank you. Matthew Harrington's.
Right, okay, yeah. The other question, so I do have another question if no one else wants to jump in. I don't want to hog the whole session, but the other question I had was just if one of the students following this in any of these sessions, or someone who's following it independently, was interested in trying out Treebanking but wasn't a classicist in the normal sense, or wasn't strongly comfortable in Greek or Latin, wanted, for example, to annotate in their own language, let's say English or Finnish. Would you have any advice for them? I mean, they presumably would use the universal dependencies tag set in Arethusa, and where else might they go for help, etc.?
For Finnish, you would have to go somewhere else. I mean, there are tree banks done the universal dependencies also for Finnish language, but that's I haven't, because I don't study Finnish, so I haven't familiarized with that. In Arethusa, there was the possibility, like Polina showed, that to also use English tag set, but there were no other languages there. So if you're using Arethusa, then that's for they had their own selection of languages there.
But so for English, then where would they look up the guidelines and so forth?
Universal Dependencies website, maybe.
Okay.
That's the place to go. Yeah.
Great, thanks. Okay.
I was wondering if we still have a couple of minutes.
Surely.
Then maybe, Polina, could you showed how to create the artificial token, and you showed where you can sort of locate it in the sentence, but could you also show that in the XML, in fact, it doesn't go in between the sentence?
Yeah, thanks for reminding me of that. It is, in fact, really useful, because we want to make sure that when we're querying the actual text and not any additions by us or any annotator. So let me just share the screen again. It would be the easiest. Okay, so let me find an annotation where I have an artificial token. Here, I have one. Okay, so when you go back to the XML and you scroll to the tree where you have inserted that token, see how it is listed at the end of the sentence. and it also has this special addition to the rest of its annotation that says it's an insertion and that it's an artificial elliptic note, so that when you query, this does not participate in the results that are shown. Yep.
Lovely, thank you. Okay, well, we're almost perfectly in time, unless anyone wants to add anything else. No? In which case, we'll thank you very much again to Polina and Marja. We'll see you all again next week for the session on translation alignment, and another session on tree banking a week after that. So thanks you all very much. See you soon.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Cheers.